Petén forest of Guatemala, Central America, barely visible above the forest canopy, the tips of ancient pyramids peep through the tropical vegetation. Once, more than a millennium ago, as many as 100,000 people lived here in the city of Tikal. Tikal's inhabitants were the Maya, an intellectual, literate and artistic people who created remarkable cities, carefully planned and built with temples, pyramids and public spaces. Irrigated farms supplied their food, reservoirs stored their water. At the height of their prosperity between 250 and 900 AD, the Mayans developed mathematics to the point that they could predict eclipses and make complex engineering calculations. In their hieroglyphic script, they recorded astronomical data, the achievements of their warriors, and lists of their priests and rulers. There was regulated trade, sport, and distinctive artwork. But around 850 AD, something happened. Over the next 100 years, Tikal, along with the other Mayan cities, seemed to be abandoned. No one knows why. There's been plenty of speculation. It could have been a sudden climate change, an internal uprising, a sudden outbreak of disease, or an invasion from outside. But hard evidence has been in short supply. In the neighboring country of Belize, a Mayan site had lain forgotten for centuries. Now it's being excavated and is turning up some unexpected information. Dr. Elizabeth Graham has spent 30 years excavating Mayan sites in Belize. Recently, she's concentrated on one in particular, Lamani. Archaeologists at Lamani had an untouched site to work on. At first, what they uncovered seemed to follow the accepted theory of Mayan history. But soon, the site began to reveal something quite new.
There's lots of evidence for people living here during what's known as the Maya collapse in the 10th century, when a lot of other sites are supposed to have been abandoned.
Elizabeth and her team are trying to discover why this site did not suffer the same fate as its neighbors. Carbon dating revealed that people had lived here for 3,000 years, from 1500 BC to 1450 AD. The site had been occupied long before the Maya appeared, through the whole of the Mayan Golden Age, and considerably beyond its collapse. Collecting the evidence from ceramic fragments to human bones is a painstaking task. Examining skeletons found at the site is archaeologist Christine White. Christine is applying modern techniques to see if there is anything about these ancient Mayans that might explain why things were different at Lamani.
Well, we treat every individual as if it were a forensic case. So we would try to reconstruct what we call an osteobiography, which is really a life history of that individual.
Much can be learned from these human remains. Sex, age, diet, and state of health can all be determined.
For vitamin C deficiency, for example, we see little, sometimes fairly large, what we call hematomas, like swellings, just below the surface of the bone. You see a loosening of the teeth, a degeneration of the bony tissue that holds the teeth in place. So that's how we would detect scurvy. Vitamin D deficiency shows up largely through the curvature of weight-bearing long bones, so in the legs.
The people of Lamanai showed few signs of poor diet. The bones revealed that although their diet varied over time, the population remained healthy.
The skeletal evidence has been really helpful in revealing information about diet and dietary changes through time. And so far there are indications that there were some periods when people turned to the lagoon for more fish. And it may be, for example, that living near the lagoon did help. Skeletally, there is evidence that diet has changed. There is evidence that people adjust. And some of it does suggest that living near the lagoon was helpful.
But just as archaeologists were getting used to the idea that Lamanai alone of the Mayan cities had carried on undisturbed, evidence of something even more perplexing began to emerge from the site. As the other Mayan cities were being abandoned, buildings at Lamanai were being destroyed and then rebuilt.
I think you can see here, we have a really good example of construction right through the collapse. We have here the well-cut stones of a classic period building. It's, in other words, existed right before the collapse. Really good way, I think.
The excavation showed that around the date of the collapse of other Mayan sites, the Maya at Lamanai stopped using the old style of construction and instead started building with wood. This pattern seems to occur all over the site. In places, new wooden buildings are constructed on top of old stone ones. And it's not just the architecture that changes. There are new cultural patterns too.
We begin to get a burial style that I don't know from earlier periods, and this is people buried on their faces with the legs tied back, which at first I thought might be a burial of a sacrificial prisoner because they're depicted that way on the stone monuments, but it's far too common.
Upheaval and change at Lamanai and abandonment of cities all around. All this suggests invasion. But if invaders had conquered Lamanai and rebuilt the city, why had they not done the same at Tikal and all the other abandoned sites? Then, new evidence began to emerge from the work of Linda Howie, who is dating and analyzing pottery from the site. These fragments, meticulously gathered, span the entire history of its occupation. The style of each piece is analyzed and compared.
Diversity of surface treatments. You have vessels in which a red color has been applied to the surface. Red is a very dominant color. This is an example of a vessel that had one color applied to the surface, and through its firing, they've been able to bring out these coloring effects. We also have vessels like this in which they've applied an orange color to the surface and then painted with black and red paint to, do particular images like jaguars and this kind of abstract image here.
These diverse and vivid designs all belong to the period before the general Mayan collapse. But these examples from a later date have simpler shapes and uniform colors. They seem to have been made by completely different craftsmen. But a detailed examination of the manufacturing techniques told a different story.
What we learned when we looked closely at the pottery that we found that was made during the collapse is that the forms were really different. The forms and the colors and the way that they were decorated were very different from the pottery that turned up at most sites during the classic period. When we looked more closely at how the pottery was made, we discovered that the fabrics were the same, if not the same, very, very similar, which suggested that the people who were making pottery, Mr. and Mrs. Average, the production groups that were here, the ceramicists, were the same people because they went to the same resources, they mixed them in the same way, but the forms were really radically different. And that's what we find really interesting, is this dichotomy.
It looked as if the craftsmen hadn't changed after all, but they seemed to be following different instructions. It's as if the people had cast off their traditional Mayan identity and put on a new one. So what could explain these developments at Lamanai?
Based on the evidence so far, what I think happened is that the local population remained the same, that there were largely the same families, the same craftspeople, the same fishermen. They stayed here, they didn't move. But there was a major change in who governed them. And that is the question or the mystery. Who were those people? How did they get here? Were they local? And if they were, what made such dramatic changes?
Whatever had happened to the Maya in the 9th century AD, the people of Lamanai had been able to adapt to it, embracing new ideas, changing their way of doing things, simply staying put and surviving. But while we may have some answers for this site, we're no closer to explaining what happened in the rest of the Mayan world. Elizabeth feels that we may have been asking the wrong questions. Led astray by the romantic notion of vanishing civilizations, we may not have looked hard enough for other explanations.
I think the research at Lamanai, I'd like to think, I hope, will affect the way people view the rise and fall of civilizations. Not only, let's say, at the level of the general public, but as far as archaeology is concerned as well. Because I think that the assumption that the Maya collapse has affected the way we've looked at many sites.
What we're looking at
I think for some reason we want to see the ancients as somehow having a more mysterious cycle, so that, you know, ancient civilizations can collapse and disappear, but of course we don't. And I'd like to think that Lamanai will help to get us to look at the Maya very much as the way we look at our own civilization.
Techniques and attitudes in archaeology have changed over the last century since the first Mayan excavations. Early sites might have yielded more if modern methods had been available then. Perhaps a re-examination of them will bring new insight to those crucial years of change.
I'd like to think that what we've learned here will change aspects of archaeology. I think it has already, but I think there's more to come.
What Elizabeth's research and that of today's other archaeologists shows is that the civilizations of the Americas didn't disappear in the dramatic sense we once believed. They changed and evolved, reacting to new pressures within and without, much as our societies do now. And we're realizing that the people themselves didn't vanish. They simply adapted. The civilizations of the Americas were amongst the most glittering and complex the world has ever seen. But change is a constant condition, and nothing lasts forever.